February 23rd, 1945. 6 men struggled to raise an American flag atop Mount Suribachi, a 556-foot volcanic peak on a tiny island in the Pacific. The photograph of that moment would become the most iconic image of World War II and one of the most powerful symbols in American military history. But what that image doesn't show is the 36 days of absolute hell that unfolded on that island, a battle so brutal it would forever change how the United States Marine Corps viewed war. Iwo Jima, a volcanic chunk of land just 8 square miles in size, located 660 miles south of Tokyo. From above, it looked insignificant, a dark speck in the vast Pacific Ocean. But for the more than 70,000 Marines who landed on its black volcanic ash beaches, Iwo Jima represented something very different, the gateway to hell itself. This wasn't just another Pacific battle. Iwo Jima shattered dark records that stand to this day. It was the only battle in United States Marine Corps history where American casualties exceeded Japanese casualties. Of every 3 Marines who set foot on that island, 1 was killed or wounded. 27 medals of honor were awarded, more than half of them posthumously. Admiral Chester Nimitz would sum up the brutality of the fight with a devastating phrase: "Among the Americans who served on Iwo Jima, uncommon valor was a common virtue." The answer lies in a deadly combination of factors. Geography that completely favored the defenders, an enemy who had abandoned all conventional tactics in favor of a fight-to-the-death strategy, and the Japanese perception that they were defending sacred homeland soil for the first time in the war. To the Japanese, Iwo Jima wasn't just occupied territory in some distant country. It was Japanese soil itself, part of the Tokyo prefecture since 1891. Losing Iwo Jima meant allowing the enemy to establish a base just 3 hours flight time from the imperial capital. It was unthinkable. That conviction transformed every Japanese soldier on the island into something more dangerous than any enemy the Marines had ever faced. Men who weren't fighting to win, but to kill as many Americans as possible before they died. When General Tadamichi Kuribayashi arrived on Iwo Jima in June 1944, he knew exactly what the Americans expected to find. They expected another battle like Tarawa or Saipan, fierce but relatively brief engagements where the Japanese squandered their forces in suicidal banzai charges within the first hours of combat. Kuribayashi was determined to give the American Marines something completely different, a nightmare that would stretch on for weeks. Kuribayashi was no ordinary fanatic. He'd lived in the United States, studied at Harvard, and understood American industrial capacity better than any other Japanese commander. He knew Japan couldn't win the war, but he also knew he could make the Americans pay such a high price for each island that the American public's will to keep fighting might be exhausted. Iwo Jima would be his masterpiece of calculated destruction. His first radical decision was to completely ignore orders from Imperial High Command. Traditional Japanese doctrine required forces to defend the beaches, destroying the enemy while he was still vulnerable in the water. Kuribayashi looked at the black beaches of Iwo Jima and saw something different, a perfect trap. He would deliberately not defend the beaches. He would allow thousands of Marines to land without significant opposition and then turn the entire island into a slaughterhouse. What made this strategy possible was Iwo Jima's very geology. The island was essentially a dormant volcano filled with soft volcanic rock called tuff that could be excavated relatively easily but became extremely hard when exposed to air. For 8 months, 21,000 Japanese soldiers worked like miners, excavating the largest network of tunnels and bunkers ever built on a Pacific island. The result was terrifying in its complexity. 11 miles of interconnected tunnels snaking through the island, some at depths of 90 feet. These weren't simple tunnels. They were complete underground complexes with hospitals, command centers, ammunition depots, barracks, and even operating rooms. Many chambers had multiple entrances and exits, allowing Japanese soldiers to move invisibly underground while Marines fought above. The defensive positions were the work of a mad engineer. Machine guns were positioned in concrete bunkers with only small openings for the barrels, making them nearly impossible to detect and even harder to destroy. These bunkers were connected to tunnels that allowed gun crews to escape when under direct attack, only to reappear in another bunker 300 feet away. The Marines would discover they could clear the same area 3 or 4 times, only to be shot at from behind by positions they swore they'd destroyed. Kuribayashi also innovated in artillery placement. Traditionally, guns were positioned in locations with good battlefield visibility, but that made them vulnerable to American naval bombardment. So Kuribayashi hid them in caves and tunnels with only small openings from which they could fire and then retreat to safety before any counterattack could reach them. He positioned mortars in depressions and craters where they remained invisible, creating what Marines would call steel rain, shells falling from nowhere onto their heads. Mount Suribachi, that extinct volcanic mountain at the island's southern end, was transformed into a fortress within a fortress. 7 levels of tunnels honeycombed its interior, sheltering more than 1,000 soldiers. Artillery positions were carved into the slopes, with overlapping fields of fire that covered every inch of the landing beaches. The preparation wasn't just physical. Kuribayashi also broke the most sacred taboo of the Japanese Bushido code. He ordered his men not to die uselessly. No banzai charges, no spectacular suicide attacks that wasted lives without tactical gain. Each soldier had one mission: kill at least 10 Americans before dying. "We must not die without taking 10 enemies with us," he wrote in his battle orders. "To the last man, each one will make Mount Suribachi his tomb." This philosophy created a type of fighter the Marines had never encountered before. These weren't fanatics screaming as they ran toward American machine guns. These were patient killers, hidden in positions prepared months in advance, willing to wait days for the perfect opportunity to kill one Marine before dying. Meanwhile, the Americans prepared with typical confidence. Naval intelligence had identified many defensive positions through aerial reconnaissance, but the true extent of the tunnel system remained unknown. The most intense naval bombardment of the Pacific War was planned. 74 consecutive days of shelling by warships and airstrikes. 16 million pounds of explosives were dumped on the small island before the landing. American planners estimated the island would be captured in 5 days, a week at most. General Holland Smith, commander of the expeditionary forces, was more cautious, estimating 10 days of combat. Even the most pessimistic estimates didn't exceed 2 weeks. Everyone was tragically wrong. The massive bombardment had stripped every tree from the island and transformed the ground into a lunar landscape of craters, but the underground bunkers remained intact. Kuribayashi had won the first round before the battle even began. February 19, 1945, 8:59 a.m. The first amphibious landing vehicles touched down on Iwo Jima's eastern beach. Marines jumped into the black volcanic sand, expecting the hellfire that always accompanied amphibious landings, but found only disturbing silence. No shots, no explosions, just the sound of waves and the roar of Amtrak engines. It was a trap, and Kuribayashi executed it perfectly. He let wave after wave of Marines land, allowing thousands of men to accumulate on the narrow beaches. He let them begin climbing the volcanic sand terraces leading inland. The sand wasn't like normal sand. It was fine volcanic ash that gave way underfoot, making every step an exhausting effort. Marines sank to their ankles, sometimes to their knees, fighting for every yard gained. And then, at exactly 10 o'clock, hell broke loose. From perfectly camouflaged positions on Suribachi to the south, from the plateau to the north, from invisible bunkers left and right. Thousands of Japanese weapons opened fire simultaneously. Mortars, artillery, machine guns and rifles converged on the crowded beaches. There was no cover, nowhere to run. The volcanic sand that made advancing difficult now made digging protective foxholes impossible. It simply collapsed back in. The first day was a bloodbath. Of the 30,000 Marines who landed, 2,420 became casualties, killed or wounded. That was more than the total casualties of many entire Pacific battles, and it was just the beginning. As night fell, Marines expected the traditional nighttime banzai counterattacks that had characterized other battles, but Kuribayashi had forbidden them. Instead, his forces made small, silent raids, killing sentries, infiltrating perimeters, creating psychological terror. In the following days, Marines began the slow and bloody advance across the island. Every yard was contested, every bomb crater hid a Japanese sniper, every rocky outcrop sheltered a machine gun nest. Marines developed a tactic they called blowtorch and corkscrew, flamethrowers to burn defenders out of their positions and explosives to seal tunnels. But even this had limited effectiveness against the vast underground network. Mount Suribachi became the first priority. The mountain dominated the beaches, and the entire operation was under observation by Japanese gunners at its summit. The 28th Marine Regiment began the assault through a nightmare of minefields, barbed wire, and devastating crossfire. It took 3 days of brutal combat to reach the mountain's base. Then the climb began. Every vertical foot of Suribachi's slope was covered by defensive positions. Concrete bunkers had overlapping fields of fire, making it impossible to attack one without being exposed to 3 others. Marines used demolition charges, bazookas, and flamethrowers to clear each position, only to be targeted from others they hadn't detected. February 23rd, a 40-man patrol led by Lieutenant Harold Schreier reached the summit. They carried a small American flag and at 10:20 a.m. raised it on a piece of pipe found among the debris. The photograph of that moment generated moderate celebration, but then, later that same day, a second, larger flag was taken to the top. Photographer Joe Rosenthal captured the moment when 6 Marines, 5 of whom would die in the following weeks, struggled to raise the flag against the wind. That image would become immortal, but capturing Suribachi meant only that 1/3 of the battle was complete. The deadliest 2/3 still awaited on the northern plateau. There, Kuribayashi had concentrated his best troops and most elaborate defenses. Marines now faced what they called the meat grinder, an advance measured in yards, not miles, where each gain cost dozens of lives. Defensive positions on the northern plateau were masterpieces of military engineering. Reinforced concrete bunkers, some with 10-foot-thick roofs, withstood direct naval bombardment. When Marines finally destroyed a position, they'd discover it was connected to a labyrinth of tunnels through which the defenders had already escaped. Entire Marine units would clear areas, declare them secure, and then get shot at from behind by Japanese who had emerged from tunnels they didn't know existed. Combat developed a brutal, repetitive rhythm. Dawn brought naval artillery bombardment on Japanese positions, then Marines advanced, measuring progress in yards. Flamethrowers burned out bunkers, explosives sealed tunnels, snipers dueled with Japanese sharpshooters hidden in rock crevices. By afternoon, wounded were evacuated under continuous fire. At night, Japanese infiltrators probed the lines, creating panic and exhaustion. Water was scarce. Volcanic sand penetrated everything. Weapons, food, wounds. Sulfur from the volcanic soil created toxic fumes in some areas. The wounded often died waiting for evacuation because the Japanese deliberately targeted medics and stretcher bearers. Psychological casualties, men who simply broke under the stress, began to rival physical casualties. One of the deadliest sectors was nicknamed the Meat Grinder, a fortress complex that included a rise called Hill 382, the village of Motoyama, and a rocky outcrop marines called the Turkey Knob. This sector consumed entire units. Companies that landed with 250 men finished the battle with 50. Some units suffered 75% casualties. Lieutenant Keith Wells of Company C reported that his unit lost all officers and 90% of enlisted men in 3 days of combat. Sergeants led entire platoons because there was nobody else. Cooks, clerks, and mechanics were sent to the front lines as riflemen because replacements couldn't arrive fast enough to replace losses. The Japanese were also suffering horribly, but they were dying in their positions as planned. Kuribayashi had calculated perfectly. His men were killing more than 10 Americans each before dying. March 26th, 36 days after the initial landing, the battle was officially declared over. Of the 21,000 Japanese troops on the island, only 216 surrendered alive. The rest died, including General Kuribayashi, whose body was never found. Of the nearly 70,000 Marines who participated in the battle, 6,121 were killed and 19,217 wounded, a casualty rate of 37%, unprecedented in American history. Strategically, Iwo Jima proved its value. B-29 bombers attacking Japan now had an emergency base halfway there. More than 2,400 bombers landed on Iwo Jima during the war, many too damaged to reach any other base. Each of those aircraft carried an 11-man crew. Mathematically, lives saved exceeded lives lost. But that math offered little comfort to the thousands of families who received telegrams of condolence. Iwo Jima changed something fundamental in the Marines. Veterans who fought there rarely spoke about the experience. The island became a sacred symbol of sacrifice, a measuring stick by which all other battles would be judged. Uncommon valor was a common virtue. Nimitz's words were engraved on the Marine Corps War Memorial in Arlington, ensuring that Iwo Jima's legacy would never be forgotten. The small, volcanic ash island was returned to Japan in 1968, but remains under military administration. Only a few civilians live there today. Kuribayashi's tunnels still exist, largely unexplored. And on the black beaches where so many died, the sand still maintains its peculiar texture, soft, dark, and hellish underfoot, exactly as the Marines remembered it.